They came at dusk. The first fire started on an ordinary street, 1 block from a school, 1 block from what used to be laughter and streetlights. A single truck burst into flames. Then another. In minutes, the sky above the city turned the color of blood and gasoline. For people hiding behind their doors, it began like a nightmare, the kind that feels too real to wake up from. Windows trembled. Power lines hummed. Somewhere in the distance, gunfire echoed, short, sharp, then silence. Within hours, cars were burning across the highways. Entire neighborhoods disappeared behind curtains of black smoke. The roads, once filled with traffic, became graves of twisted steel. And above it all, the sky flickered with the orange reflection of a war that no one had declared, but everyone understood. This was no accident. It wasn't random chaos. It was a message. Someone had decided that fear itself would be the new law. Families huddled in dark rooms, whispering prayers. Mothers pressed their children's faces into their chests to muffle the sound of explosions. Fathers stood at windows with trembling hands, watching everything they built go up in flames. That night, every sound had meaning. A car engine meant danger, a knock meant death. And by morning, the cities that once glowed with life had become ghost towns surrounded by smoke. The streets had changed hands. And the men who owned them weren't politicians, weren't soldiers, they were cartels. What began as a quiet battle for control had become something far darker, an open war, spreading from the mountains to the coast, swallowing everything in its path. It was more than a fight for territory. It was revenge. It was betrayal. It was the price of power, paid in blood. But before we get to the war, before we see the cities fall and the alliances burn, we have to go back. Back to the moment it all began. To the first handshake that sealed a deadly pact. To the man who thought he could control it all, and lost everything instead. Because in the world of the cartels, peace is an illusion. And every truce is just the silence before the next explosion. This is the inside story of how a country caught fire. Of how the battle for money, power, and loyalty turned cities into war zones. And of how one single mistake, one secret call, lit the match that would set it all ablaze. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand how it started. And why it can never truly end.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
When you trace a fire back to its beginning, you almost never find a flame. You find a spark, small, quiet, almost invisible. A conversation behind closed doors. A promise whispered over a phone line. A decision that seemed harmless, until it wasn't. That's how this began. Before the chaos, before the burned cars and bullet holes. There was order, of a kind. Different cartels ruled different lands. Each man knowing his limits. Each boss keeping his peace by force and fear. The mountains had their kings. The coast had its merchants. And the border towns. They were the veins through which everything flowed. Money, weapons, power. For a long time, it worked. Bribes kept the peace. Corruption oiled the machine. Everyone took their share. And the violence stayed in the shadows. But shadows don't stay still forever. Someone always wants more. Someone always thinks they deserve it all. One man, quiet and calculating, believed he could unify the trade. Bring it all under one banner. He promised stability. Claimed it wasn't about greed. said it was about balance. But balance in this world is just another word for control. He began building his empire city by city, buying loyalty with money, and fear with bullets. Those who joined him prospered. Those who didn't, vanished. For a while, it seemed unstoppable. The shipments grew. The money doubled. And silence returned to the streets. But peace bought with fear is a loan that always comes due. And on the other side of the mountains, another man was watching. He was younger, hungrier. A soldier who rose from the dirt. While the first man negotiated, this one fought. He didn't want balance. He wanted dominance. He believed that power came from terror, from making the world flinch at the mention of his name. Their paths were bound to cross. Not because they hated each other, but because the world wasn't big enough for both of them. At first, it was just tension. A truck hijacked here. A shipment stolen there. Each side blamed the other. Then, the first body appeared. No message, no warning. Just silence. And the kind of fear that spreads faster than news. From that moment, the truce that held for years began to crack. Officials tried to calm it quietly. Money changed hands in smoky rooms. But loyalty is fragile in a business built on betrayal. Every handshake was a lie. Every smile had a knife. Soon, the violence began to spill into the streets. Not the random gunfire of petty crime, but coordinated, military-style ambushes. Convoys attacked. Officers executed. Entire towns waking to find walls painted with blood-red warnings. And through it all, people whispered the names of two men. Names that became legend. Names that would divide a country. On one side, the old order. A cartel that saw itself as the guardian of tradition. On the other, the new blood. Fierce, unpredictable. Ruthless enough to challenge everything. For decades, the drug war had been fought in the shadows. But now, it was stepping into the light. Cameras caught images of armed convoys in daylight. Banners flying. Men in tactical gear waving their weapons as if declaring independence. The government called it criminal. The people called it war. And for those trapped in between, there was no side to choose. Only survival. In small towns, families began to flee. Entire villages emptied overnight. Those who stayed behind lived by a new code. Don't speak, don't look, don't ask. And yet, in the silence, rumors grew. That the young commander wasn't acting alone. That someone inside the system was feeding him intelligence. Routes, targets, lists of names. Because every war needs money. And power always has friends in high places. By the time anyone realized how deep it went, it was too late. The lines had been drawn. The sides chosen. And the fire had started to spread. What began as a feud between men was now consuming cities. And before long, those cities would burn. Next, we follow the spark as it turns into a storm. The first attacks. The first massacres. And the night that changed everything. Pause. Deep breath. Because once the streets learned the language of war, there was no going back. The first shots were fired on a Tuesday. The city woke to smoke, thick, heavy, crawling through the streets like fog. At first, no one understood what was happening. People thought it was another protest, another explosion in some factory. But when the gunfire echoed, sharp and endless, the truth hit like thunder. This wasn't chaos. It was a message. Within minutes, roads were blocked, tires burning in intersections. Convoys of armored trucks moved through neighborhoods once filled with children walking to school. Masked men with assault rifles shouted orders no one dared question. Police radios went silent. Calls for help went unanswered. And above it all, helicopters circled like vultures. It wasn't just one city. It was many. Coordinated, planned, executed with military precision. Stations attacked. Officers ambushed. Government buildings torched. The young commander had made his move. A declaration that the old order was finished. They called it La Noche de Fuego. The Night of Fire. And it lived up to its name. Every corner of the city burned. Every sound, engines, screams, bullets, blended into one endless roar. People hid in basements, clutching their phones, watching the orange glow crawl across their windows. The government called for calm. But calm doesn't exist when the line between soldier and criminal disappears. By sunrise, whole districts were reduced to ashes. Dozens dead. Hundreds missing. The streets littered with shell casings and silence. And then came the footage. Clips began to surface, shaky videos taken from balconies and car dashboards. Trucks filled with gunmen. Dozens moving as one, communicating with radios, with military discipline. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were an army. And the message was clear. No city, no authority, no power could stop them. But wars don't end with a single battle. They spread, feeding on revenge, on pride, on blood that demands more blood. In the days that followed, retaliation began. Checkpoints were set up. Commanders sent kill orders. Bodies appeared hanging from bridges. Warnings written across their chests. People stopped using certain roads. They stopped talking after dark. Every night felt like the beginning of the end. And yet, beneath all that fear, there was something else: profit. For every explosion, someone got richer. For every gunfight, a shipment crossed a border unnoticed. The chaos wasn't just violence, it was business. And business was booming. Inside government offices, phones rang non-stop. Politicians blamed rivals. Officers blamed commanders. But no one wanted to say what everyone already knew. That the cartels weren't just fighting each other anymore. They were fighting the state. The war had grown too big to contain. And the casualties were no longer just soldiers or dealers. They were teachers, doctors, taxi drivers, children. Innocence was collateral. Reporters who tried to expose it disappeared. Whole newspapers shut down overnight. The silence became its own kind of weapon. And as the smoke cleared from one city, another began to burn. The pattern repeated. Coordinated strikes, public displays, revenge killings. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about dominance, pure, unrelenting dominance. Each side fought not just to win, but to humiliate the other. Videos circulated. Messages were broadcasted. The war had gone digital. Fear was now viral. The young commander's men painted their insignia on walls. Their message on banners that hung above highways. We run this now. For the people living beneath those banners. Life became a countdown. To the next explosion. The next gunfight. The next missing name. And as both sides pushed harder, the body count became impossible to hide. Even the air felt heavy. Thick with smoke. Thick with the stench of burning oil and blood. The old boss, the one who built his empire on silence and order, watched everything unravel. His men were losing ground. his influence fading. And for the first time, he felt fear. Not of dying, but of being forgotten. Because in this world, death isn't the worst thing that can happen. Being erased is. And so, he made a choice. A desperate one. A move that would change everything. He decided to fight back. Not in the shadows. Not quietly. But with fire. The retaliation that followed would turn the war into something the world had never seen before. A campaign so brutal, so public, that it would scar entire generations. This wasn't about drugs anymore. It was about power, revenge, and survival. Soft pause, tension rises. And from that moment on, no one, not even the most powerful men, would be safe. Revenge doesn't announce itself. It creeps in quietly. In the silence between gunshots. In the tremble of a hand reaching for a phone. The old boss had watched his world burn. Now, he was ready to return the favor. No press conferences. No threats. Just action. His orders moved faster than the news. Within hours, old connections were revived. Men who owed favors. Men who remembered what loyalty used to mean. Money flowed like blood through old veins. Weapons were bought in bulk. And entire towns turned into training grounds overnight. What began as a cartel war was transforming into something closer to a civil war. A brutal, invisible conflict with no rules and no mercy. The first retaliation came at dawn. 3 armored trucks rolled silently into a rural town known for loyalty to the young commander. Within minutes, gunfire shattered the stillness. By the time it stopped, the town square was painted in crimson. Messages were left. Spray painted on walls. Carved into the metal of burned vehicles. Simple. Direct. Terrifying. We are still here. The young commander's men found the bodies hours later. No survivors. No witnesses. For him, it wasn't a warning. It was an insult. He responded the only way he knew how. By doubling the violence. His convoys struck back. Hitting warehouses, safe houses. And even family estates linked to the rival boss. This wasn't about business anymore. It was about pride. It was personal. Each side began keeping score. Not with profits, but with bodies. And the numbers climbed. Hundreds at first. Then thousands. The line between the guilty and the innocent disappeared. People stopped asking who started it. They only asked who's left. Villages turned into ghost towns. Fields once filled with harvests became burial grounds. The rivers ran dark after every storm. A sickening reminder of what had been washed away. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, there were moments that broke even the hardest hearts. A mother searching for her son who never came home. A child standing in the doorway of a burned house. Clutching a photograph blackened by smoke. They weren't soldiers. They weren't enemies. They were simply caught in the crossfire of power and pride. But in this war, innocence meant nothing. Soon, the fighting spread beyond control. Highways became battle zones. Checkpoints turned into execution sites. And every night, another town went dark. The government promised justice. The people stopped believing. Helicopters hovered above the cities. Searchlights sweeping through smoke. While on the ground, the real war raged unseen. Every bullet had a purpose. Every death, a message. It wasn't just about killing rivals anymore. It was about breaking them. making them fear the very ground they stood on. Then came the night that changed everything. A convoy belonging to the young commander's men was ambushed on a highway. Dozens were killed. But among the dead was someone close to him. Too close. A brother. A shadow. The one person he trusted completely. That single loss shattered him. The man who once led with calculation and control became something else. A storm with no direction. Driven only by vengeance. From that night on, his war had no strategy. No limits. Only rage. Entire neighborhoods were burned in retaliation. Civilians taken as leverage. Anyone suspected of helping the enemy, gone. And through it all, the world watched in disbelief. Images of entire cities in flames. Families running from homes. Soldiers overwhelmed. A country trembling under its own weight. But the truth is, this wasn't just happening in one place. It was spreading. Slowly, quietly, inevitably. The war had taken on a life of its own. No one could stop it now. Not the police. Not the politicians. Not even the men who started it. Because once blood becomes the currency of power, no one wants peace. They want payback. And as the bodies piled up, one question began to echo across the nation. How far would they go before there was nothing left to fight for? The first city to fall never saw it coming. It started like any other night, music echoing from the bars, headlights weaving through traffic, laughter spilling out onto warm streets. But beneath that calm, something was moving. Trucks with tinted windows rolled in from the highway. Engines humming low. Radios silent. Men inside dressed like soldiers, but they weren't from any army. By the time the first shots rang out, it was already too late. The streets exploded into chaos. Gunfire cracked through glass. Car alarms screamed into the night. And people ran, not knowing which direction was safe anymore. It wasn't a battle. It was an invasion. Within minutes, the city's skyline was glowing orange, flames climbing from gas stations, from buses, from homes. The air filled with the smell of burning oil and fear. Helicopters circled above, but they didn't fire. They just watched. Because no one, not even the authorities, knew who was in control anymore. The young commander's men had come to make a statement. And they made it loud. Government buildings were torched. Police stations raided. Roads blocked with burning vehicles. The old order, the empire built by silence and money, was collapsing, block by block. And the people caught in between? They became the forgotten ones. Families hid in basements as fire spread through their neighborhoods. Children covered their ears against the explosions. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every knock could be death. By dawn, the city was unrecognizable. The once bustling plazas were filled with rubble. Banks and stores reduced to black skeletons. A thick smoke covered everything. As if the sky itself was mourning. The news called it a night of unrest. But for those who lived through it, it felt like the end of the world. And it wasn't the only one. Days later, another city burned. Then another. Each one worse than the last. The war was spreading faster than anyone could contain. And now, it wasn't just between the cartels. The government had entered the battlefield. Convoys of soldiers rolled through the highways. Tanks parked on street corners. Helicopters hovering above neighborhoods. But every time the military moved in, the cartels moved deeper. Into the hills. Into the alleys. into the very heart of the people. Because when you can't tell the enemy from the neighbor next door, every home becomes a battlefield. Entire cities became zones of silence. No one spoke. No one trusted. No one slept. The war had changed. It wasn't about drugs anymore. It was about domination. A fight to decide who would rule not just the streets, but the fear inside every mind. And yet, even in all that destruction, somewhere deep inside the chaos, betrayal was brewing. The young commander's army, once united, unstoppable, had begun to fracture. His lieutenants wanted more territory, more power. And his enemies were offering it. Money, weapons, protection, all in exchange for one thing: his head. He didn't see it coming. How could he? When you rise too fast, you forget who helped you climb. And those same hands are always the first to pull you down. Inside his organization, whispers spread like smoke. Secret meetings. Hidden alliances. A phone call here, a promise there. And in a world built on loyalty bought with fear, it only takes one bullet for everything to fall apart. One night, one of his trusted men vanished. By morning, his body was found, tortured, burned. Left on a bridge with a message written across his chest. It wasn't just a warning. It was the beginning of the end. The young commander lashed out. Paranoid, desperate. Executing anyone he suspected of betrayal. But the more he killed, the more enemies he made. Meanwhile, the old boss watched from a distance. His empire in ruins, but his influence still alive. He knew the young commander was unraveling. He could smell the blood in the water. So he did what every survivor does. He struck a deal. Not with other cartels. Not with politicians. But with people higher than both. The kind who never show their faces. Who control wars with a signature and a smile. Within weeks, the tide began to turn. Checkpoints reappeared. Armed patrols doubled. Information started flowing, routes, names, hideouts. The young commander's strongholds began to fall. One after another. Like dominoes collapsing under their own weight. But still, he refused to surrender. He called his men together. Those who remained loyal. And with nothing left to lose, he prepared to take the war into the heart of the enemy. The plan was madness. Storm the city that once belonged to his rival. Strike fast. Burn everything. Erase the past in one night of fire. And so it began. A night even darker than the ones before. Explosions ripped through the streets. Gunfire echoed through narrow alleys. Men shouted orders through the chaos. Their faces lit only by the flames of burning buildings. Civilians fled in every direction. Cars crashed in panic. The power grid failed. The entire city plunged into darkness. Lit only by fire and gunfire. From the rooftops, it looked like the earth itself was burning. And in the middle of it all, the young commander stood watching. Smoke in his lungs. Blood on his hands. A man who once dreamed of power. Now surrounded by ashes. His empire, gone. His allies, dead or missing. His name, now a curse whispered in fear. In the chaos, he tried to escape. Disguised, hidden, hunted. But his enemies were already waiting. The same men who once toasted to his rise, now celebrated his fall. He was cornered. Alone, out of ammunition, out of time. And in those final moments, as the flames closed in, He realized something the old boss had always known. In this world, no one wins. Power is temporary. Fear fades. And the fire always burns the hand that lit it. By dawn, the shooting stopped. The smoke began to clear. The city, or what was left of it, was nothing but ruins and silence. Reporters arrived hours later, their cameras capturing the wreckage. A portrait of what happens when greed becomes God. The government declared victory. The old boss called it justice. But for the people who lived there was no victory. Only loss. Homes gone. Families missing. Memories turned to ash. And even as the streets cooled, the fear didn't. Because deep down, everyone knew. Wars like this don't end. They just change names. Weeks later, a rumor began to spread. That the young commander had survived. That he'd escaped through the mountains. That he was rebuilding, waiting. Watching for the perfect moment to return. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. But the rumor was enough. Because in this world, legends never die. They just wait for the next fire to start. The cities were still burning, not with flames, but with memory. And for those who lived through it, the war never really ended. It just moved to another street. Another face. Another night. When the smoke finally began to clear, the world looked different. The streets that once echoed with gunfire now lay in silence. Buildings stood like hollow shells, walls blackened, windows shattered, doors hanging from hinges. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of burned gasoline. The war that had set cities on fire was over. At least, that's what they said. But wars like this don't end with peace treaties or signatures. They end in exhaustion, when there's nothing left to burn. And that's exactly what was left, nothing. No victory parades. No celebrations. Just silence, and the slow sound of a country exhaling after years of holding its breath. In the early days after the fighting, soldiers patrolled empty streets. They moved cautiously, weapons raised, eyes scanning rooftops. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every corner could hide a ghost of the war that had just passed. Bodies were still being found. Buried in shallow graves, abandoned in fields, hidden behind factory walls. Some were identified. Most were not. Families searched through ruins, holding photographs, asking questions no one dared answer. Mothers walked from morgue to morgue, clutching rosaries and shaking hands. Children waited at bus stops that no longer led anywhere. The war had taken everything, lives, homes, names, and left behind only questions. In the official reports, the government called it a victory. They said order had been restored. They said justice had been served. But the people who lived through it, they knew better. Because true victory isn't measured in territory or arrests. It's measured in how many people never come back. And too many didn't. The old boss had survived. Quietly. Cleverly. He'd outlasted the chaos by stepping into the shadows at just the right time. When the war ended, his name was no longer on the streets, but his influence still was. He had learned that real power doesn't come from fear. It comes from silence. From the ability to disappear when the world catches fire, and return when the ashes cool. So while the cameras focused on the ruins, he rebuilt, slowly, strategically. Not with guns, but with money. New faces appeared in his place. New names. New corporations. And behind those facades, the same blood still flowed. It was a quieter kind of empire now. Invisible. Untraceable. but no less powerful. Meanwhile, the young commander was gone. Dead, they said. But no one ever found his body. Some claimed he'd escaped into the mountains. Others said he'd been buried under the ruins of the very city he tried to burn. His name became legend, a ghost story whispered in bars and prisons. And in this world, ghosts are dangerous. They live in fear. In memory. In the stories people tell when the power goes out. For a time, there was peace. At least on the surface. No gunfire. No convoys. No burning cities. But beneath that calm, the ground was shifting. The war had destroyed the balance that once held everything together. The old cartels were weakened, fractured into smaller, hungrier pieces. New groups emerged, ruthless, untested, desperate to claim what was left behind. Each one promised order. Each one swore they would be different. But power has a way of corrupting even the cleanest hands. And soon, the cycle began again, quietly at first. A disappearance here. A convoy hijacked there. Whispers of new alliances. New enemies. The fire had dimmed, but it had not died. In the cities that burned, life tried to return. Shops reopened. Children played in cracked courtyards. People rebuilt homes from scraps of what was left. But the scars remained, in the concrete, in the silence, in the eyes of those who survived. At night, when the streets went quiet, the memories came back. The sound of explosions. The smell of smoke. The faces of those who never returned. Some tried to forget. Others refused to. There were those who still searched, for answers, for justice, for the truth. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized the truth was buried under too many lies. Files disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Investigations closed overnight. It was as if the war itself had been erased, rewritten by those who survived it. One woman, who lost her husband and 2 sons in the fighting, said it best. "They killed my family, and then they killed the truth." For years, her words echoed in documentaries, in courtrooms, in the hearts of people who refused to let the story die. Because even in silence, some voices refused to fade. But silence, that was the new rule. Journalists were warned. Officials were bought. Those who spoke too loudly vanished without a trace. And the country, weary and broken, looked the other way. Because fear had become normal. And in a world where everyone is afraid, no one asks questions anymore. Years passed. The cities were rebuilt, new paint over old scars. New leaders took power. New promises were made. But the foundation beneath it all still burned. Every new wave of violence could be traced back to that war. To the blood that was spilled and the debts that were never repaid. Generations grew up with stories instead of history. They learned early what not to say. Where not to go. And how to disappear when danger comes close. The war had ended. But its shadow stretched across time. And in that shadow, new names began to rise. Younger, smarter, more ruthless. Children who had watched the fire as boys. Now men building their own empires. They didn't want to inherit peace. They wanted to inherit power. The old boss saw it coming. He knew the cycle was returning. The hunger, the greed, the same mistakes repeating in new hands. But he was too old to stop it. He'd built the world that allowed it to exist. And now, he would die watching it consume itself again. One night, in a quiet house far from the city, the old man sat alone on his balcony. The sound of the waves mixed with the distant hum of engines. He poured himself a drink, looked out over the dark horizon, And for the first time in years, he smiled. Not out of joy, but out of understanding. He finally realized what his life had really built. Not an empire, not a legacy, but a chain reaction. One that could never be stopped. Somewhere, another young man was already picking up the pieces. Already gathering loyal soldiers. Already planning his own rise. And just like before, it would start small. A handshake, a promise, a deal sealed in silence. Then the trucks. Then the guns. Then the fire. Because in this world, fire is not destruction. It's tradition. The cities may rebuild. The names may change. But the pattern remains the same. Greed. Revenge. Blood. Silence. Every generation inherits it. And every generation repeats it. Believing they can control it. Believing they can win. But the truth, the one everyone learns too late, is that no one wins a war built on blood. The cartels don't. The government doesn't. The people definitely don't. All that's left is the silence. And that silence, it's louder than any explosion. It echoes in every empty street. It lingers in every burnt wall. It hides in every child who grows up hearing stories instead of lullabies. That's the real aftermath. Not the smoke. Not the rubble. But the silence that follows. The kind that seeps into your bones and never lets go. Years later, people still ask. Who started it? Who ended it? Who won? But maybe the better question is, what was lost that can never be rebuilt? A generation of dreams. A lifetime of names erased. A country that learned to live with ghosts. Because when cities burn, the flames eventually die. But when people burn, the fire lives on forever. This is what remains. A nation that survived the impossible, but carries its scars beneath the surface. And somewhere, in a forgotten town, a new whisper begins. A new name. A new promise. The same story. With different faces. Because in the end, the cartel wars never truly end. They just change shape. And as long as there is power to take, money to earn, and revenge to claim, the fire will always find something new to burn. Inside the bloody cartel war that left cities in flames. You've heard the story. But remember, it's still being written. Years have passed. The fires that once lit up the skies have long gone out, and the cities that burned have been rebuilt, taller, shinier, and somehow emptier. To the untrained eye, life has moved on. Children laugh in the streets again. Markets hum with music and color. Tourists snap photos beside murals of peace and resilience. But beneath the surface, the memories still whisper. Every brick, every street, every faded bullet mark holds a story. And together, they tell a truth most people would rather forget. Because the war may have ended, but its consequences did not. The generation that grew up in the flames carries invisible scars. They learned early that life could change with a single gunshot, that justice was often a word without meaning, and that survival sometimes meant silence. Some escaped the world that raised them, moved across borders, started new lives, changed their names. Others stayed, unable to leave the soil where their families had fallen. And some chose to rebuild the same empire that destroyed them. It's strange how power always finds a way back home. What was once a battle for control turned into something else, a system, an economy, a culture of silence built on fear and survival. Even now, in the highest offices and deepest prisons, the ghosts of that war still pull strings no one dares to name. And yet, there's something even more haunting than the violence itself. How normal it became. There was a time when a single explosion would paralyze a city. Now, it barely makes the news. A body found in the street used to shock people. Now, it's part of the morning routine. That's what legacy looks like here, not statues or memorials, but numbness. A quiet acceptance of chaos. Because when you live long enough inside the fire, the smoke starts to feel like air. Those who fought and died, soldiers, civilians, innocents, they left behind more than grief. They left behind questions. Unanswered, uncomfortable questions that no one in power wants to face. Who gave the orders? Who armed the killers? Who profited when the cities burned? Every file that disappeared, every witness who vanished, every case closed without justice, it all points to the same uncomfortable truth. The war wasn't just fought by the cartels. It was fueled by the very systems that claimed to fight them. Politicians gained power. Corporations gained money. The media gained stories. And the people lost everything. That's the lesson few want to acknowledge, that behind every so-called cartel war, there's a web of corruption, fear, and greed that stretches far beyond the borders of a country. It's not just a Mexican story. It's a human story. A global story. Because wherever there's desperation, there's someone willing to exploit it. Wherever there's pain, there's someone ready to profit from it. The old boss understood this before anyone else. That's why he survived. He didn't fight for drugs. He fought for control, over men, over fear, over history itself. And by the time he died, quietly and alone, his empire was already reborn under new names and new flags. Different faces. Same hunger. Same blood. The young commander, his myth outlived him. His story became legend in the prisons, in the neighborhoods, in the whispers of those who still dream of power. To some, he was a monster. To others, a symbol, proof that even the poor and forgotten could rise and make the world tremble. That's the tragedy of this war. In the absence of heroes, even villains become icons. And so, the cycle continues, born not from ideology, but from necessity. In a world where justice is scarce, power becomes the only religion people can believe in. But every cycle leaves its mark. Every flame consumes something that can't be replaced. Walk through the ruins of any city touched by this war, and you'll see it. A child's toy buried under concrete. A name scratched onto a wall. A street corner where laughter never returned. The true legacy of this conflict isn't the cartels that rose or the politicians that fell. It's the silence of millions who learned that speaking up could cost them everything. That silence has become part of the landscape, woven into songs, stories, and even the language itself. People speak carefully now. They pause before they name names. They look over their shoulders before they tell the truth. And maybe that's the final victory of the war. Not the territory, not the money, but the fear that still lives in the hearts of those who survived it. Yet, even in the darkness, not everything is lost. Because every generation produces a few who refuse to stay quiet. Journalists who keep digging. Mothers who keep searching. Children who grow up vowing never to repeat the mistakes of their fathers. They are the quiet resistance. Not with guns, but with memory. They fight not for revenge, but for remembrance. They remind the world that stories like this aren't meant to glorify the killers, but to honor the lost. Because forgetting would mean letting it happen again. And if there's one lesson to be learned from the cities that burned, it's that silence is never safety. It's surrender. The war taught everyone how fragile civilization really is. How quickly the rules break down when greed meets desperation. And how, once the flames begin, no one, not the rich, not the powerful, can fully control where the fire spreads. It taught us that evil doesn't always come wearing a mask. Sometimes, it wears a suit. Sometimes, it gives a speech. Sometimes, it promises peace and delivers war. The greatest danger isn't in the violence itself, but in how easily the world gets used to it. And that is why stories like this matter. Not because they're entertaining, but because they remind us what's at stake when humanity loses its way. Every viewer who listens to this story, every person who still cares to ask why, becomes part of the resistance against forgetting. History repeats itself only when no one is watching. So watch. Remember. Speak. Because the war may seem distant, but its echoes reach farther than the borders that contain it. It lives in the headlines we scroll past, in the statistics we ignore, in the quiet suffering of people whose stories never make it to the screen. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes. A siren, a scream, a single gunshot in the night. They are the reminders that peace is fragile, and silence can be dangerous. In the end, the lesson is simple but unforgiving. No one wins a war built on fear. No one builds a future on ashes. And those who try will watch it all burn again. The flames will return. New names will rise. And once again, the world will pretend to be shocked. But for those who truly know, who lived through it, who lost everything, the story never ended. It only paused. And maybe that's what makes it truly terrifying. That even after everything, it can still happen again. Because all it takes is one spark. One betrayal. One promise made in the dark. The war began with ambition. It ended with silence. And somewhere in between, a country lost a piece of its soul. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. Inside the bloody cartel war that left cities in flames. This isn't just a story about crime. It's a story about us. About what happens when power becomes more valuable than people. And silence becomes more comfortable than truth. The fire has faded, but the ashes still breathe. And as long as they do, the story isn't over. It's still being written. Right now. Somewhere. The world moves on. New headlines, new wars, new stories to chase. And slowly, the smoke begins to fade from memory. But the scars never really leave. They live in the soil, in the rivers, in the hearts of those who survived when survival wasn't guaranteed. They walk among us, the forgotten, the nameless, the ones who saw too much and said too little. History doesn't always live in books. Sometimes, it hides in the silence between two strangers, in the glance of a mother who's lost her son, in the way a city flinches at fireworks that sound too much like gunfire. We tell ourselves the war is over. We convince ourselves the monsters are gone. But deep down, we know the truth, they don't disappear. They adapt. They wait. They change faces and flags. And the cycle begins again, just under a different name. Maybe that's why the story never truly ends. Because the world keeps forgetting. And forgetting is how it all begins again. For every cartel that falls, another rises. For every promise of peace, another deal is made in the dark. And for every generation that swears it won't repeat the past, there's always one voice whispering. Just one more chance. One more empire. One more fire. It always starts small. A handshake. A favor. A shipment that never gets reported. Then the silence returns. And the fire spreads again. But there's something stronger than fear: memory. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the story, the truth can't be buried. It can't be erased by money, or bullets, or time. That's why this story matters. Because it isn't just about cartels or violence. It's about how quickly a nation can lose itself in the noise. And how hard it is to find its voice again. It's about the people who refuse to forget. Who stood in the ashes and said, "Not again." The world may never know all their names. Their stories may never fill headlines. But they are the reason there's still something left to save. And maybe that's the smallest light left in all this darkness. That even after everything burned, someone still cared enough to remember. Because remembering is resistance. And resistance is survival. The fire took cities. Took lives. Took futures. But it didn't take the truth. And if you've listened this far, then you're now part of that truth. Part of the memory. Part of the reason it won't be forgotten. So when you leave this story behind, don't let it fade into noise. Carry it with you. In silence. In thought. In understanding. Because the next time the world starts to burn, you'll recognize the smoke. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one who refuses to look away. This has been Inside the Bloody Cartel War that left cities in flames. Remember the fire. Remember the silence. And never forget what it cost.